But, you know, Steve Ratner, the problem is right now we don't have testing. Americans can't get tested because we have a president and a CDC that has botched this from the very beginning. So until we get that testing, until we know how widespread this pandemic is in the United States of America, I mean, we can't start figuring out when companies are going to come back online. We can't start figuring out when people are going to start filling into stadiums again. We can't figure out when they're going to start spending their money again. Can we?
No, of course we can. And I think, Joe, you talked about a health crisis and a financial crisis. There's one crisis in between, which is an economic crisis. The financial crisis we're looking at is really a reflection of what's going on in the economy. This is very different than in 08. 08 was a financial crisis. We had a fundamentally more or less healthy economy and then a financial crisis. Here, the economic crisis is that people have basically starting to stop work. Essentially, the economic activity, as Mika just read off, is dropping at a dramatic pace. And that is going to come at a huge cost to our economy. When I was on the show, I think 3 or 4 days ago, it looked like there was maybe a 65% chance of a recession. I think today it's well over 90%. The bank economists are all taking down their forecasts very substantially. JP Morgan is predicting negative growth in the first quarter, negative growth in the second quarter. You can't have this much of a cessation of economic activity without it having a major implication for the financial markets, which obviously see recession. Have the markets overreacted or not? I think certainly a part of what's going on in the financial markets reflects a lack of leadership at the top, a lack of testing kits, a president who goes on television to try to reassure the nation, and the stock market immediately rolls over. There's really no sense in the Wall Street community that I live in. There's no sense that there's any leadership here or any plan for how we're going to get out of this. And that's why you see the market in this panic stage. Will it stay that way? I don't know. It depends a lot on what happens in Washington. And the last thing I would say is that when you have a recession, which we will almost certainly have, you need to react to that, and you need to provide this is where Washington has a job, which is to provide support to the economy in this time. They're talking about a bill in Washington at the moment, which is a completely inadequate bill to address the broader economic questions. It may address sick leave or this or that. It's not going to stop the recession. We need a major piece of legislation out of Washington, and given the gridlock that's been down there for 4 years, there's absolutely no sign of that happening.
Yeah, but you know, Willie, what concerns me is that everybody's talking about, and I watched CNBC yesterday, and there are a lot of people on there talking about, oh, we need the federal government to provide this stimulus plan. We need the federal government to provide this plan to workers, et cetera. I mean, yes, we need to figure out how to provide economic relief. But again, you're just putting a bandage on a much bigger problem that's going to continue to fester until you take care of the underlying problem. We need somebody telling us why we're not able to get test kits to Americans. We're not able to get accurate figures on how widespread this pandemic is. We're not able to predict where this pandemic is going to go in the coming months until we begin the testing consistently. And that's what is so frustrating to me right now is everybody's talking about putting together packages for economic relief. The problems are going to continue until we take care of the medical issues underneath, and that starts with testing.
Joe actually sounds like the biggest investors in the market right now who are not talking about economic stimulus. The two things they are asking for are the number are tests, a vaccine, and simply how many people here have it. Right. You remember Dow futures plummeted right after the president spoke, because the first thing he was talking about was how much better we've done than Europe, how many less people we have than Europe. Remember, it was people overseas who are waking up to that going, sorry, you have no idea how many people who have it. You haven't even tested everyone.
Yeah, the markets are like the rest of us, like people. They want to know what the hell is going on and where the end of this is. Let's also bring in Ian Bremmer. He's president and founder of Eurasia Group and foreign affairs columnist and editor-at-large for Time Magazine. Ian, good morning. You've been talking and writing a lot about China. Steph just mentioned that the 42 Apple stores in China are opening again. Maybe that's some kind of a signal that progress is being made. What has China done? We know that they've hidden a lot of the numbers. We know there's corruption there. We know it's a different kind of society than we have here. What has China done to begin at least to get its arms around coronavirus that maybe we can learn from here?
Well, they mishandled this desperately at the beginning, as you say. But since then, the recognition that Xi Jinping had personal vulnerability in not reacting effectively to coronavirus led to an extraordinary amount of direct quarantine, over 70 million people in the most severe quarantine surveillance state that we had ever experienced in the history of the world. And as a consequence of that, their new cases are now down to virtually nothing, in the double digits on a daily basis compared to the total of almost 100,000 that we've heard. And that's meant that their economy has started to restart. It is restarting more slowly than they would have liked, precisely because they don't want further outbreaks, and that's going to have an economic implication. The other thing I'd mention more broadly, we say, what's China doing, is they're responding with propaganda very effectively against the United States. Inside Chinese media, the amount of anti-U.S. propaganda you're seeing is immense compared to when we had the China deal with the United States, when they were being much softer.
Based on what? It obviously started there. So what's the anti-U.S. propaganda?
Based on the Americans going out and saying, well, you know, this is the Wuhan flu, it's the China flu. You're seeing that from the Republicans. You're seeing that from the Trump administration, from President Trump himself. And also with some of the talk of, well, now this is going to bring manufacturing back to the U.S. The official spokesperson of China yesterday came out and actually floated a conspiracy theory that this originally came from the American military. And in Europe, while the Europeans are looking at the Americans and saying, how dare you announce, our ally, announce a travel ban of our citizens before you even tell us, before you even coordinate. They condemned it uniformly. The Chinese are going to Italy, a member of Belt and Road, and say, oh, we're going to provide you with a lot of medical aid, and you actually see the planes showing up. So when we go to China and say things like, we want you to help us with Huawei in 3 and 6 months' time, the Chinese have made immense ground. Final point here. Steve talked about how we're probably entering almost certainly an economic recession right now. The backdrop of this is a geopolitical recession. We don't have the ability to respond in a coordinated fashion. We've had 2 G0 summits so far, emergency of the finance ministers, central banks. They've come out both times and said they're monitoring the situation. There's no emergency G20. There's no symmetry between Trump and the other leaders. That lack of political resilience is an immense problem for dealing with this globally going forward.
Ian, we don't even have the ability here to come to some agreement as to what we would do, let alone with the rest of the G20.
That's
the
right.
Political system is in dysfunction, and that's affecting the markets.
No question.
I just want to very quickly underscore one thing you said. China did respond effectively after botching it a little bit at the beginning.
That's right.
But they did things that we cannot do in this country. I think they quarantined hundreds of millions of people. They got everybody's cell phone data. They tracked they used their facial recognition technology. They put people on lockdown whether they liked it or not, and, you know, no due process. They just did it. And that's something that we both don't have the tools to do, nor the political will to do.
And one thing I
but
would mention is the restart that's happening in China right now. We talk about Potemkin villages. There are some Potemkin companies where the local officials are very scared about not having any new cases. So they'll set the electricity going, they'll get the trucks going, but they don't all have workers. So again, the startup in China is going to take some time.
Steve, there's one point, though. Remember what Joe was saying when we first started this. 2 days ago, we had members of the media telling America this corona is a hoax, it's a conspiracy theory. The president was saying you should go to work a week ago. So we're a far cry. I mean, we at least have to acknowledge this and tell people what to do.
Yes, I understand that. We are at the furthest other extreme. And as I said before, there's no doubt in my mind, I can't quantify it, that some percentage of what's happened in the stock market is a lack of leadership, confusion, lies, untruths being told at the top.